Bonhoeffer, one of the great theological influences of our era. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the subject of today's Austin Faith Dialogue. Stay with us.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion in life, produced by Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson of Austin Metropolitan Ministries, welcoming you to this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. And today we are pleased to give emphasis to one of the great theological figures of our time, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who practiced what he preached in terms of a death in martyrdom in the era of Nazi Germany at the very end of World War II. We have with us one who has been the interpreter of Dietrich Bonhoeffer dramatically, Al Staggs, who is an ordained minister, but who in more recent times, Al, we're glad to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You've been doing this not only in churches, but in a variety of settings, recreating the life of Bonhoeffer.
That's correct. In churches and synagogues and colleges and universities across the nation.
And let's talk a little bit about how you happen to be doing this instead of being in a pulpit.
Well, I was introduced to Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life through my professor, my mentor at Harvard Divinity School, Harvey Cox. And Harvey introduced me to the profundity of Bonhoeffer's life and his relevance for our time. This was in 1983 while I was studying at Harvard Divinity School.
And then you, did you immediately then begin to do something with it, or more recently?
Not actually. I went back, I returned to the pastorate in 1983 and pastored for about 4 years and began to reflect pastorally on the significance of Bonhoeffer's statements and his life for our time and the kinds of circumstances that we were facing, and then decided that it would be important to put together a monologue, since I was already quoting Bonhoeffer nearly every Sunday, as my wife would say.
Almost as much as the Bible.
That's exactly right.
Well, tell us just in terms of who Bonhoeffer was and why he's made such an influence, had such an impact.
Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a German pastor and a theologian during the 1920s and 30s and 40s in Germany. He was a very sensitive young theologian who received his doctorate in theology at the young age of 21 at the University of Berlin. He had an opportunity to study at Union Seminary in New York in 1930 and 31. And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of the few people, and certainly one of the few clerics, who saw through the propaganda that Hitler was giving Germany. And he was in a distinct minority among German pastors and German Christian leaders who protested against Hitler's pogroms and his policies.
So early on in Hitler's rule, he was a critic.
Oh,
and
yes.
Then what happened after that?
Well, he, in 1934, one of the things he did was found an illegal seminary at Finkenwalde, where Life Together, his famous book on community, was put together. He pastored in London, German-speaking churches in London. He became a professor. He was both a professor and a pastor. Finally, in 1939, his American friends extended an invitation for him to leave the uncertainty and danger of Germany and to come to the United States to conduct a lecture tour. He was in the United States only a few short weeks and returned to Germany because, as he said, I cannot be a part of the restoration of my homeland if I'm not there in their hour of need. And shortly after his return in 1939, he joined a conspiracy against Hitler.
Oh, to assassinate Hitler.
Yes.
And was caught and suffered the consequences of that?
Well, he was actually arrested in 1943, not for being a part of the conspiracy, because that would have been almost instant death.
Right, right.
But he was arrested for his activities in the Abwehr, which was the German military intelligence. His brother-in-law, Hans von Danier, was an attorney with the German military intelligence, and he more or less influenced Dietrich Bonhoeffer to come into the German military intelligence, and what happened there was that Bonhoeffer served as a double agent.
Oh, I see. Wow. Okay, so, but then when he was uncovered and he spent his last years in prison.
He was arrested, yes, he was arrested for really being a part of the Abwehr and smuggling Jews out of Germany.
Mm-hmm.
It was only much later, about 2 years later, that some documents were discovered with Bonhoeffer and other people's names on it, which tied him and others to the conspiracy, and then death by hanging shortly followed.
And within just a few days at the end of World War II this occurred.
As I recall, the hanging of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others occurred only 11 days before the prison camp at Flossenburg was liberated by the Allies.
Okay. I think, Al, that in order for folks to get the sense of who he was, let's have you give us a kind of a recreation of his spirit, if you would.
And so now I speak to you, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, those of you who represent a different time and a different context. I would want you to know, first of all, that I did not become a prisoner of the Third Reich as a result of some accident or some stroke of fate. Oh, no. My being a prisoner, you see, was a direct result of a decision I made when I was just 14 years of age. For you see, it was at that time that I informed my parents that I intended to pursue a career in the church. Well, my parents really had very little to say in response to my grand announcement. But my older brother Carl, the skeptical scientist that he is, reacted with a great deal of vehemence. He said, "Dietrich, tell me, why would you want to waste your intellectual ability, your intellectual prowess, on something as dead and as backward as the church?" And I recall saying to him, "Well, Carl, if the church is dead, then I will change it." I had no idea. I had no idea at that young age just what my announcement was going to cost me. Did you know my older brother Carl was sadly correct in his assessment of our church these days? You see, the church must come out of her stagnation and move out into the open air of intellectual discussion with the world and risk saying controversial things if we are ever to get down to the really serious problems of life. You see, the church was never intended to be on the outside of the village in some safe, secure little haven. No, no, no. The Church of Jesus Christ belongs right in the middle of the village, right where the crises and the dangers and the complexities and the challenges of life occur, in the middle of the village. You see, the church is only the church as she exists for others. And it is for that reason that I will tell you with a great deal of sincerity and conviction, I think the church should sell all of her property and give it to the poor. I would like to talk to you about the concept also of grace. Cheap grace is the deadly enemy of our church. You see, the church is fighting today for costly grace. What is cheap grace? Cheap grace is grace that's sold on the marketplace like cheap merchandise. Grace without price, grace without cost. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship. It is grace without the cross, grace without Jesus Christ living and incarnate. And the final concept I would like to speak to you about is the concept of the cross. You see, the cross is laid on every Christian. Oh, it's not the terrible end to an otherwise God-fearing and happy life. No, it meets us at the beginning of our communion with Christ. For you see, whenever Christ calls a person, he bids that person to come and die. You see, I think that many churches and many pastors, and certainly many Christians in Germany have forgotten the principle I call fatal privilege. And what is fatal privilege? Fatal privilege really means that if we have been given privilege or power or prestige or position in this life, if we have accrued it by birth or by attainment from our work, then we should be willing to lay aside that prestige, those possessions, and that power for the sake of the voiceless and for the sake of the oppressed. But did you know that many Christians and pastors and churches have been so unwilling to let go of their privilege and their power, and they have not spoken whenever the powerless and the oppressed have been persecuted? For after all, that is what I understand the cross to mean. For after all, Jesus Christ laid aside his privileges for our enrichment.
Serving Austin means serving you. That has always been the primary goal of Austin Metropolitan Ministries. We are religion in action through the work of these organizations. Each plays a key role in making the capital city a better place to live, but we can't do it alone. Do you have some spare time, talents, or any resources that you can share? If you do, please call AMM at 472-7627, because serving Austin means serving you.
Welcome back to Austin Faith Dialogue, where today our focus is upon Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the great theological influences of our century, and whose birth we are observing this year, 90 years after he was born. Al Staggs, we're wanting to thank you, too, for your giving us a sense of Bonhoeffer's thought in the first half of the show. I know one of his, when you were at Austin Seminary doing some work there, I'm sure you were studying more of his this cheap grace, came from a book called The Cost of Discipleship?
That's correct. And what I was focusing on in my studies at Austin Presbyterian Seminary was Bonhoeffer's relevance for post-Holocaust theology, and how do we now speak both as Christians and as Jews after the awful experience of the Holocaust or the Shoah.
Mm-hmm. So what you were just saying in terms of the cross and grace, as the cost of discipleship is distinct from cheap grace.
Yes.
You were looking at not just as applied to Germany, but as applying to us today.
That's correct. I think Bonhoeffer's struggle of the soul and the questions he asked in his time are questions that we are now wrestling with in our own time, for we, both Christian and Jew, must ask ourselves, what happened in the Holocaust? How could this happen? Christians must ask, how could this be an occurrence how could the Holocaust happen in a Christian nation, if you will.
I was interested in the brochure you gave me before the show about different folks who have seen you do this and have commented on it. Rabbi Barton G. Lee, the Hillel Jewish Student Center in Arizona State University.
Yes.
I think the Jewish community there and in other places would appreciate the fact that he spoke to that issue of anti-Semitism. Bonhoeffer did.
I have happily discovered that many Jewish groups and Jewish leaders have responded very positively to the legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer because of the fact that he not only spoke out against Hitler, but he actually gave his life in opposition to the oppression of Hitler.
Well, that's what makes his influence, I think, so great, is that he enacted what he was teaching and preaching, and that became a model for both people in the Christian and non-Christian communities.
Exactly.
I'd like to also take note that Henri Nouwen, a great Catholic thinker and I think a person leading in the devotional life of our time, says the play captures very beautifully the great message of Bonhoeffer. And what you do is to give a whole presentation that kind of covers his life, isn't it?
Yes. What I try to do is in 50 minutes of the presentation is to capture the spirituality of Bonhoeffer. I try to capture his humanity, as I mentioned before, his struggle of the soul, also his commentary on the German Christian culture at that time, his opposition to it.
Why don't we have you share a little bit more of that with us dramatically, and then after you've done that and before the end of the program, I'd like to come back and let folks know how they can get a hold of you and where you might be sharing this otherwise. But for now, let's return to the presence of Bonhoeffer with us today.
Thank you. Whenever I begin to reflect and to reminisce about times past, I usually begin with the years 1930 and 31, whenever I had the distinct privilege of studying at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And there I had the privilege of studying with America's preeminent theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr. And did you know, as important as Professor Niebuhr's influence was upon my young life, there was one other person who was to have an equal impact upon my life, and that was the person of Frank Fisher, a black man. You see, it was Fisher who introduced me to the hidden side of this nation which was so proud of her piety. It was Fisher who introduced me to Harlem. He introduced me to racism. And it was through that association with Frank Fisher and worshiping with his church, the Abyssinian Baptist Church, there in the middle of Harlem, that I came to the most radical and profound revelation, I do believe, of my entire life. And what is that? It's quite simple. For the first time in my privileged existence, I began to look at life from a totally different perspective. I began to look at life from the perspective of the outcast, from the perspective of the reviled, the prisoner, the suspects, the marginalized, the poor. In short, I began to look at life from the perspective of all those who suffer. And they taught me about discipleship in a way I had never been taught before. You see, they taught me that privation is the lot of the true disciples in every sphere of their lives. They have nothing to call their own, not even a foot of earth to claim as their home, and they certainly have no earthly society to claim their absolute allegiance. And they taught me that Jesus knows about all of the others too, those preachers and the teachers of the national religion, those who enjoy greatness and renown, those whose feet are firmly planted in the culture and the piety of the people. But those are not the ones who are called blessed. And then there was the year 1933. Would you explain to me how that could happen? I mean, how could a nation that was so technologically advanced, so culturally astute, so Christian in her orientation, how could that nation allow a maniac such as an Adolf Hitler to take power and then to maintain power for 12 agonizing years? Well, I have my theories. First of all, you must understand that Adolf Hitler promised a restoration of the national economy. Secondly, Hitler promised renewed respect for Germany among the nations of the world through intense militarization. Thirdly, Hitler promised to vigorously fight the Bolsheviks. And fourthly, Adolf Hitler promised to restore traditional moral values to German life. And fifthly, Hitler promised us security. Oh, and how we Christians worshipped at the God of security while we allowed the systemic evil of genocide to eat away at our souls like a cancer. And God will not hold us guiltless. No.
No, I suspect that we will not be held guiltless in our time either. You obviously found some parallels between what Bonhoeffer was teaching and our experiences today.
Yes, very much so. I think there is a danger in any culture, and ours included, that what happened in Germany can happen here, it can happen anywhere, especially when people of faith, people who should know better, equate their security or their national identity with the will of God.
Well, I'm being interested to know what kind of reactions you're getting. Tell us some of the places that you performed this and what people have been saying directly to you.
Well, included among those places that I've been privileged to perform are at the Trinity Church in New York, at the National Cathedral on 2 occasions. One occasion that I was especially happy to perform at was in April of 1993 when the National Cathedral invited me to return to perform the play in honor of the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum.
All right.
And then at Arch Community in Toronto, Canada, that you mentioned with Father Now, and Princeton Theological Institute and the Chautauqua Institute of 1995 in New York.
So if folks in this part of the country would like to be in touch with you about having you do this perhaps in a church or in a community setting, I know you don't live in Austin, you live in San Antonio.
Correct.
But let's see if we can find an address here that people can get a hold of you, and then the 210-492-8457 phone number that they could call you and talk to you directly.
Yes.
And what are your plans now as far as where you go next?
Well, I go to Lufkin, Texas tomorrow, and then to Arlington, Texas on the weekend, and I'll actually be doing a comedy program at First Baptist Church, Arlington.
Oh, really?
Which is another program that I do, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And then Monday I'll do several colleges and seminaries during the week, and then October 6th I'll be doing doing the Bonhoeffer and the humor presentation for the 60th meeting of the Baptist Joint Committee on Public Affairs in Washington, D.C. I'll be performing the play, interesting enough, at the Clintons' church, Founder United Methodist Church, on Sunday morning, October the 6th.
Oh, really? As part of the service?
Yes.
Uh-huh. Well, now, you said Believe It or Not. Was that the name of your program?
No, it's called Laughter for Living. It's the
Okay.
humor program. And I have been doing comedy impressions for more than 30 years, far longer than I've been doing Bonhoeffer.
Uh-huh.
And it's a lot of fun to really shift gears and to do comedy impressions such as Jerry Lewis and Gomer Pyle and
Oh, my word.
Red Fox and Robin Williams.
Your talent must be as versatile as your facial expressions.
Well, some have said that, yes.
Well, now, tell us a little bit about Bonhoeffer's humor. I mean, he was a real live human being with, I'm sure, that dimension to him.
I have an interesting anecdote that was told to me by Eberhard Bethke. Actually, this incident occurred with my talking to Eberhard Bethke, following his... Bethke is the biographer and best friend of Dietrich Bonhoeffer.
Okay, all right.
Bethke saw the presentation that I do about 5 years ago, and there was no humor in the play at all. There is now. In fact, one occurrence in the play, I have Bonhoeffer on his all fours talking to a cockroach.
Okay.
But
In his prison cell.
In his prison cell. But before I added any humor, Bethke was trying to hint to me that there needed to be a little bit of humor. And he says, well, you know, young man, you've done a very nice job of putting together the life of my dear friend, but Dietrich had a great sense of humor. In fact, he was a practical joker. And he was trying to hint to me that, that Bonhoeffer really was a comedic fellow. Bonhoeffer's fiancée, Maria von Wettermeyer, was later to say about her fiancé that one of the things that stood out to her was the great sense of humor that this young man had. He said in his letters and papers from prison that even in the most serious of circumstances, there's always a measure of humor.
Well, I think that would be an expression of the grace that he was talking about otherwise.
Yes.
And I would like to say that you have been a graceful influence for us today, Al Staggs,
Thank you.
for having come over to Austin and sharing this with us here as part of the Austin Faith Dialogue community.
It's been my privilege. Thank you, Rich.
And blessings on you.
Thank you.
And thank you, folks, for looking in on this particular program today on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We'll see you again next week. In the meantime, peace be with you all.
For more information, call Austin Metropolitan Ministries at 472